All right, I think we're going to get started with this month's webinar, which is an editor's guide to successful peer review. My name is Dr. Avriel Licciardi, and I'm one of your co-hosts today, along with my colleague and co-host, Dr. Clark Holdsworth, also from LetPub. This is a very special webinar, as we have an exclusive guest, Dr. Jeanette Vasquez-Vivar, who is an editor-in-chief. So this is an opportunity for you as authors to get all of your questions answered related to the peer review process. So before I get going, I just want to check, can everybody see and hear me? You can just answer that right in the chat function of this webinar. I do just want to briefly introduce myself. I'll do this, of course, quickly because there might be some of you that have seen this many times. But again, my name is Dr. Avriel Licciardi, or AV for short. I'm an associate editor at LetPub. And prior to joining the publishing world, I got my master's in geology from the University of New Hampshire, where I worked on reconstructing mountain glacier change in the Andes Mountains of both Peru and Chile. And then for my PhD, I continued my work on reconstructing glacier change and climate change, but I jumped up to the Northern Hemisphere and worked on the glaciers that surround the Greenland ice sheet. After getting my PhD in the geological sciences at the University of Buffalo, I then joined the great team here at LetPub and have now gotten to get to know scholars from all around the world, just like all of you that are listening in today.
And then that's me. So I'm Dr. Clark Holdsworth, a research communications manager at LetPub. If you're joining us recurring in this webinar series, you've seen a lot of me. Today, I'm mostly going to be in the background. I want to give most of the opportunity to our guest speaker, who Hindawi, our sponsor, has graciously connected us with. But briefly, prior to my time as the research communications manager at LetPub, I earned a doctorate in physiology from Kansas State University. I was at the College of Veterinary Medicine there, where I studied the O2 transients from ambient air all the way down to muscle myoglobin, particularly in states of dysfunction like chronic congestive heart failure, which we developed a few models for. And that's it for me, AV.
All right. Jeanette, if you'd like to come on board with your audio and video and give us an introduction of who you are for our attendees, that'd be great.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Avriel. I'm Jeanette Vasquez-Vivar. I'm in the Medical College in Wisconsin. I am a professor of biophysics, and my research background revolves around nitric oxide synthase and tetrahydrobiopterin. So early on in my career, I graduated from biochemistry from the University of Concepcion in Chile. I did my PhD in São Paulo, University of São Paulo in Brazil. And that connects me to Milwaukee since I developed expertise in electroparamagnetic resonance. And I have done quite a bit of work on that area. And also more recently, I have moved to examine the role of brain injury, fetal brain injury in motor dysfunction, particularly focused on the role of nitric oxide synthase and tetrahydrobiopterin. That also is a cofactor for hydroxylases in the brain and important in the production of neurotransmitters. So I joined Hindawi, specifically oxidative medicine, cellular longevity, about 5 years ago as a reviewer, and since then I was asked to help with the journal in a quality of editor-in-chief. I'm happy to be here and to answer the question the best I can. So Hindawi is one of the largest open access publisher that offers a portfolio of peer review journals across a wide range of scientific subjects and medical disciplines. It has over 220 open access journals that ensures full access to everyone to new data that is published across biological science, medicine, physical science, social science, education, mathematics, engineering, computer science. So you can see that there is a breadth of science in the journal. Hindawi reports their acceptance rates, the times of decision, and other important metrics that might be important to consider in their webpage. Hindawi journals are indexes in databases like a Web of Science, Scopus, PubMed. So they are very easy to find, and this helps in the promotion of your science across major social media and communication networks that enhance the visibility of your articles and your science. So you can see here that in specifically in oxidative medicine cellular longevity, we have an acceptance rate of 48%. We have an impact factor of 507, which is great, and it's one of the highest in open science journals in this area of medicine. The journal hopes to be used as an important source of information and knowledge in several areas, including cancer, immunology, cardiovascular literature, and serves as a forum for everyone to bring new ideas, particularly related to what we know as a bench to bedside research and translation to clinical sciences. If you would like to know more about the journal, this is our link, and you can explore later.
All right, well, Jeanette, thank you for the wonderful introduction to yourself, to Hindawi, and also for the journal that you work for. And it'll be wonderful to get your insight on the topic of the peer review process at the end of these few content slides that I've developed for us. So what I want to show the attendees today is we've put together some content slides here, kind of from two different points of view. So we want to discuss the peer review process from you as an author, so you submitting a manuscript to a journal, and the challenges that go into the peer review process and review as one component. So that would be the publication and peer review. And then we also want to talk about you as a reviewer, as a peer reviewer, and how you can increase quality in peer review within the community, but also within the reviews that you write for journals as well. Jeanette's going to have a lot of insight into both of these topics for you during our Q&A. So again, I really encourage all of our attendees to write any questions they have about either of these topics or anything related to the peer review process, and put those questions into the Q&A function. And again, if you see a question that you're interested in having an answer to, again, simply just upvote that question. So just to quickly review, if you're not super familiar with the journal review process as a whole, starting at the top left of the slide here, you as the author will write your manuscript and then submit it to a journal of your choice. That manuscript will then go to the journal editor, who will initially assess that manuscript. And this is the first point where your manuscript might be rejected or returned to you, or potentially transferred to a more suitable journal within that publisher's family. If your manuscript does continue on within the peer review process, the journal editor will identify reviewers. Sometimes you will have the chance to suggest possible reviewers for your manuscript. Once your manuscript is sent to those reviewers, there are various different modes of peer review. You may be somewhat familiar with some of these, like single blind and double blind. Those are often the most common, but there's quite a multitude that are emerging that we think you should be aware of, and I'll touch on those in a few moments. After your manuscript is peer reviewed, which can take as short as a week or so to a very long time, even up to a year sometimes, those reviews will be returned to that original journal editor, who will then assess those reviewer comments. And oftentimes this falls into a variety of categories, such as accepted with major revisions, accepted with minor revisions, or rejected. And it's very, very uncommon that your manuscript would be accepted with no revisions whatsoever. If your manuscript falls into one of those accepted categories, you'll have the opportunity to make revisions based on the reviewer's comments as well as the journal editor's comments. And if it's rejected, however, you will have to seek another journal. Again, it may also be transferred within that publisher's family. If all goes well, hopefully the revisions that you make will satisfy both the reviewers and the journal editors, and then your manuscript will ultimately be accepted and published. In terms of the types or modes of peer review, these are the three most common types that you may encounter. Single blind is when the authors don't know the identity of the reviewers, but the reviewers know who you are and your colleagues. Double blind is when both parties do not know the identity of each other. And then another more common one is known as the open model of peer review, where authors know the identity of the reviewers, and the reviewers also know the identity of the authors. And again, these are the three most common types, but publishing is getting a little bit more complicated these days because there are a variety of different modes of peer review, and these vary by journal. So it's very important for you as authors to familiarize yourself with the types as well as the advantages and disadvantages that come with each mode. So we've already reviewed the top three here, but it's also important to know that there's something called transparent review. And this is often when the reviewer report or the peer review is posted along with a published article. And sometimes reviewers have the option to select whether or not they want to share their identity. Transparent review is a little bit complicated because there's a variety of different types of transparent review that exist between publishers and within journals. So again, understanding that and looking to the guidelines is important. There's also something known as a collaborative peer review model, and this is where two or more reviewers might work together to give you a single reviewer report that you can then revise from. Alternatively, you as authors might get the chance to actually work with those reviewers or under the supervision of those reviewers to finalize your manuscript. There's also something known as post-publication review, and this is when your published manuscript is up for review, whether that's from the academic community or also the public. And this usually occurs alongside other types of peer review that I've discussed before. And again, I already kind of alluded to this. There's also this kind of transferable component that's emerging within publishers. And this is when perhaps your manuscript doesn't quite fit the scope of the initial journal that you chose, but the journal editor does believe it can be published in a journal that's within that same publisher family. So they might transfer your initial submission or perhaps the rejected manuscript along with the peer reviews to that other journal to see if it can be published, there. So again, all of these are different types of peer reviews to be aware of. And there are also pros and cons, which we can probably discuss during the Q&A, that you should also be thinking about as well. The other common questions that come for the author as going through the peer review process are why your manuscript is rejected. So I'm sure a lot of you that joined us today are really curious to pick Jeanette's brain and learn how to facilitate a smooth and easy peer review process. So right here we have kind of a top 10 list of common reasons for manuscript rejection. These fall into the category of that initial desk rejection by a journal editor, as well as from the peer reviewers. So again, you want to really look to the guidelines of your journal that you select to make sure that your manuscript doesn't get rejected because it just fails that initial screening. Understanding the journal's mission or the journal's aim and scope is also incredibly important. So making sure your work matches with the mission of the journal. Peer reviewers might notice a lack of novelty, impact, or even originality. So you need to learn how to frame your research in that context. And then you also want to make sure that your hypothesis is clear, that the language is strong, and that you adhere to the journal's author guidelines. If you are in the medical field, you want to make sure that you aren't violating any ethical principles that you need to be aware of, that you support all of your claims with evidence, and that you have an adequate reference list to illustrate your knowledge of the field. So these are all things that I want to get you guys thinking about in terms of being authors that submit for peer review. So again, if you have any questions related to what I've just reviewed, as researchers, going into the peer review process or having experience within the peer review process, again, put those into the Q&A. So the other component of our webinar today is how you as a researcher can assist the community as a peer reviewer. And it's important to be a good peer reviewer. And that might seem pretty straightforward, but this is a service that you're doing to the community. It's very much appreciated. And I think probably all of us have gotten some reviews that perhaps were rude or were very short or not constructive in any way, and it's a little bit disappointing. So you as a researcher can become a good peer reviewer with a few tips. The first of which is to be mindful of time. It's important to note the deadline. And as an editor, I think it's very important that if your peer reviewer needs an extension, you want to know before the deadline that that they need a little bit more time. It's also important to read any editorial notifications that you receive. A lot of these are probably just reminders that your review is going to be due in a few days, but there might be changes in content that you need to be aware of. So simply just read those editorial notifications. It's also important to write intentional reviews. You are an expert in the field. You've been asked by this journal editor to provide a valuable evaluation of the paper. So it's important for you to read beyond language barriers, which I know can sometimes be difficult, but these editors are looking for scientific content. So it's important to evaluate the paper based on whether or not it's appropriate for the journal, if it's relevant, and if it's original and novel, and not simply have an entire review focused on copy editing and formatting. It's also critical to be aware of the journal guidelines and scope. Again, understand the mission of the journal or the organization that you're reviewing for. And many journals actually provide guidelines for peer reviewers. So they kind of lay out the expectations. So if you can find those, definitely reference those in your reviews. Two other points for being a good reviewer are to be detailed, specific, and constructive. So again, you need to provide robust and informative feedback for your colleagues. And importantly, you don't want to be rude or unprofessional in your reviews. So a good kind of way to think about this is don't give any feedback that you would not want to receive. And even more so, I suggest, not giving feedback that you wouldn't feel comfortable talking to someone face to face with. And if you decline to peer review, understand that's okay. You don't want to be overburdened because that might lead to a review that's too short and not, a thorough evaluation of the manuscript. But what we recommend is that you tell that journal editor other reviewers that might be suitable. Again, they asked you because you're an expert and you're likely to know the other experts in the field that would give that manuscript a comprehensive and constructive review. If you're not sure of reviewers, you can also indicate your availability for the future. So again, this is a back and forth between you and that journal editor and that community. Importantly, if you are a professor, you may have students or postdocs that you could recommend, which would then give those individuals experience peer reviewing, which is something that I think a lot of researchers don't know where to get started and don't know, have any training with peer review. So that's a way as a professor for you to assist your students. And that brings me to my last slide here before we get into the Q&A. So again, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. Peer reviewer training and getting credit for your peer reviews is becoming more and more possible within scholarly publishing. And this is important because it's a large part of your contributions to the community. So there are several online platforms that have emerged that provide peer reviewer training, as well as places to simply keep track of all the reviews that you do. Some notable ones are Publons, which is a platform with peer review training and organizing your peer reviews. PeerRef allows both of those options, as well as like a social academic network. And then there's a newer system called Reviewer Credits, which again is really just aligning those research contributions and associated them with, say, your ORCID ID, for example. Certain publishers are also starting to promote peer review learning with certification programs. An example of this is IOP Publishing. So if you're interested there, check that out. And then last but not least, to highlight Hindawi again here, it's important again to go to that journal website because they have opportunities for you. There's applications to become peer reviewers through certain publishers, and Hindawi is one of these. So if you want to get your name out there and show that your availability to help out the community, again, look to see if there's applications that you can fill out. So with that, I think we want to jump right into our Q&A with our guest, Jeanette. And Clark, if you have some questions prepared from the attendees, that would be great.
Yeah, that was excellent content. Thanks for prefacing our Q&A with that. And we do already have some questions. Anyone feel free to add to these as we go along. We do have a good number of people here. We peaked somewhere closer to 500 participants, so I expect several questions. The nice feature is the upvoting allows us to go with our best questions, our most interesting questions first. This one is perhaps the most general question we can cover, and it would be nice to have insight from both of you, but how do you choose the relevant journal based on your manuscript, whether that's manuscript type or scope, which can be, I think, a problem for people in their selection? What are things to look for when choosing which journal you want to go to? Because a lot of our users go to our journal selector tool. That's how they're exposed to our webinar here. You can see Hindawi's page. They lay out their journals side by side very nicely. You saw what Jeanette had for those criteria. Hindawi does a really good job of listing those for each one and allowing easy side-by-side comparison. But what should the author be thinking about when they make that final decision?
Right, that is a great question. There are several factors. One is what type of research you're doing. What is your field? That is perhaps the most critical factor to consider. It also, you have to weigh out what impact your research has. If you have top-notch techniques, methods, a large, abundant amount of data, high impact results, you're going to try to choose a paper that is going to have a high visibility for your results. If you go from there, from that top-notch papers that you are familiar with, all publishers, and you go down, you have to go down in terms of, and I'm not saying down in terms of less quality. All papers, all journals are striving for high quality of the publication, but perhaps you don't have the whole story all wrapped up. That you want to publish, you need to publish because that is important for your curriculum, for your grants. So you look for the next step that would be that going to offer you the most visibility and appreciation for the work that you have done. There is a factor of time. If you're pressed to have your paper published soon, you're going to choose a paper publication that can manage your work faster than others. And I would say that those are the most critical aspects to how to choose your journals and publishers.
Yeah, I think that those are all very good points. I think that in addition to, looking for the impact and the reach and the visibility of the journal, if you're, looking for a very baseline way to start, I think looking at the journal or the manuscripts that you reference in your own paper. So where are those papers published? And, if you jump to one of those journals and then you see, the most recent publications in that journal, you'll see if your work aligns with what that journal's been publishing recently. So that might give you a little bit of a clue whether or not your work falls within the scope of that journal.
Yeah, I think it's we quite often remind our authors that they really need to go back to previous papers. So they should be looking at the issue that's come up. And I don't think enough of them reference those articles because, Jeanette, as you mentioned, it's very important to determine your impact. Well, a lot of your impact is determined by what's been previously published in there. Do I align with that? For example, you talked about nitric oxide synthase, which is a big component of our work. And so most of our work could be described as mechanistic, which opened up a whole set of journals to us that if we don't have that element, we may not be able to submit to, and have to move on to something else. And we can only tell that by recent articles in there, seeing what type of work they're doing. Is it epidemiological? Is it mechanistic? Is it mechanistic enough? Sometimes our simple blockade studies wouldn't be adequate for specific journals that are perhaps a bit more molecular. So these are the types of questions on your field that you can answer by looking a little bit at the type of work that is making it into the journal. I think it can be very helpful. Well, thanks for that one. That was the most upvoted by far. I think that's a pretty common question. There's another one here that I'm very interested in as well. And this comes towards review articles when you talk about those different article types. And again, this is something that we see with our authors quite often. Our editor tries to give insight on whether it's only invited reviews, or it's not necessarily an invited review, but still it's just a matter of form to contact the editor ahead of time. So what would your opinion be? Is it necessary to contact the editor at the journal before you start the review article? Is it helpful? What should be sort of the rules or guidelines to follow for authors who may not have produced a review article yet when they're going into a journal submission?
Right. So I think it's a good idea to contact an editor that could guide your work. It's going to save you time, and also it's going to make it much targeted. Writing a review, it is a daunting task. A review is not just a collection of paper where you name them by time and discoveries, but the review, as Gabriel has mentioned before, it has to be intentional. You're not make a review to put a spotlight on a controversy in the literature, and why we haven't advanced to the next step, or what misconception exists about a field, and you want to correct that aspect of the research so we advance the field. So the writing a review implies that you are on top of the theme that you are discussing, that you understand all the implications, or to the best of your knowledge, right? And you are gonna add content and make people think, and perhaps even guide research for other groups. That is the intention of a review. So definitely, if you haven't written a review before, it's a good idea to get advice and perhaps even a pre-review of your work before submitting to publication and finding bad news.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think I could have a better answer than the one that you just gave. I can only speak from my field, which is geology, and most of the reviews are solicited by the editors to the authors. So reviews that are drafted and then submitted without any discussion with the journal editor beforehand aren't nearly as successful.
Excellent. Yeah, again, another one of those big ones that comes up all the time. And so it's nice to get it addressed here by an EIC. Another one that I have here is related to scope, and this time it's from the reviewer's perspective. And I'm finding a lot of questions that we have here are coming from the perspective of the reviewers as much as from our authors. So quite often you'll have a situation, I'm going to paraphrase this question, where you have you get a paper and you think it's outside of the scope. What's the best way to deal with that as a reviewer? Because ideally that's something that's dealt with by the journal staff initially, perhaps by an internal staff, or at least by the academic editor who's assigning it out, your associate editor. So what would you do as a reviewer? Do you go ahead with the review, or should you raise that as a concern before you accept it? Because that can be a little bit problematic if you're suggesting it's not part of the scope, but the journal editor has already accepted it for peer review. How would you deal with that, Jeanette?
So I think when I review, I have found a couple of those cases in my hand. And I have to say that when you submit a work, what the reviewer sees first is your abstract. It's not seeing the whole work. And based on that abstract, you think that you evaluate yourself and your own knowledge, and you think that you can contribute to that work by reviewing it. And then when you go open up the work and it is something really different from what you had in mind. So that is what the case that when have passed through the academic editor and ends up in your hands, most of previous iteration have seen an abstract. So at that point, I think I feel uncomfortable reviewing something that I don't have expertise on. I think that I cannot contribute to that work. And because of my lack of expertise, I'm gonna try to connect with something that I know about. And if it's not described, it's not gonna be in my high hopes. So I would say that the right thing to do in that case is to justify why this is not within the scope and return it to the authors and to find a better evaluation of your work and appreciation. And readers, actually, if your work is going to pass through and it's going to be published in the wrong spot, you're not going to have the impact that you want to have with your work.
Excellent. Okay, so I have several others here, and as I said, they're kind of mixed from the perspective of reviewers as well as authors. So I'm actually going to cover these two, and we can talk about them a bit. I'd be interested to hear both of your opinions. One question is, how do you get the referees to respond faster? So what is the journal doing to try to make that process as quickly as possible? It's nice to have someone from Hindawi because we know that they have a special concern for that. They try to be transparent, as Jeanette showed, with showing you statistics and being accountable for a certain timeline. Because the other question is, how long do I have to wait to hear from the journal? So what are we doing to make the process faster with referees, and what are sort of norms for an author when you are waiting for that response and maybe wondering, when should I reach out, this type of thing? Can we discuss sort of how we're progressing in that regard and what authors should be thinking about as they interact with the editor at the journal?
Right. That is a constant concern and difficulty, and is the front lines of developing the journal, right? How we move the content and get it published as soon as possible is all what we want. Maintaining quality of the work. And I would say that the bottleneck many times is to find good reviewers, appropriate reviewers. We are all in academia, we are all busy with our own work, and having time to review is not always easy. So I think that we are solving that problem by opening up a pool or where to find good reviewers. And as Avril mentioned, bringing new people and open up opportunities to everyone, so we all can work together as a community of publishers and trying to publish and be the readers of the science. So that is a big concern. We're trying to work on that in new platforms and more collaborative work. That definitely is one aspect. The second aspect I would say is on the hands of the author. If you write a good paper, if you write a clear abstract. It's easy to route your paper to the right hands and not get diverted and loose because it's ambiguous and you really don't know where it fits. So that is one super important aspect that I see for what I get into my hands. The second aspect is to have all the elements that Ariel mentioned, a concise and clear hypothesis, good methods, well described, references. So you have to help your reviewer to do the job. You have to be clear and do a discussion that addresses what is new in your paper, right? Discussion is not a repetition of things. So I think this is a shared responsibility. The author have to provide the best of their ability, clear science, and publishers are trying to do their work, trying to gather and speed up that process. So I think that we have been doing a good, there are good developments on that aspect. Things are moving along. There would be some hiccups sometimes, but overall, I think in the work that is what we are striving for.
Yeah, Jeanette, I think what you said is a great term for it, a shared responsibility between all parties. I guess another point on that is, as a reviewer, I think it's probably very appreciated if you answer the request to review the paper promptly versus waiting 5 days to turn down the review, because then that causes the paper to be delayed 5 days when you could have responded within the first day of receiving that email. So you as a reviewer can also aid in a faster review process by giving an informed decision quickly to that journal editor.
Yeah, those are excellent points. I particularly like mentioning that you can make it easier for the reviewer. So the first thing to think about is not necessarily the journals being slow, but is there something I could have done to make it faster? And Jeanette, as you pointed out, I think a lot of times a clear, higher quality manuscript, it's so easy to place. The editor knows, okay, like I've got a couple reviewers, I'm going to send it out. If they get a paper and it's unclear, like you said, the abstract is not concise, it doesn't clarify what the study is about, it may sit on their desk a little bit longer as they try to figure out who it should go to and this type of thing. So the better you do with your work, the likelihood is that it's going to go through the peer review process a little bit better. So keep in mind that you do have an impact on that as you prepare the manuscript. And I think that's a great way to help. But of course, the editor-in-chief, like they're working hard to make sure that this process is quick. And DAWA, has those relatively short review times. And then you can look at that review time and you can start to think about, okay, it's past it. Should I reach out? And when you reach out, you think, what's their issue? What do they have a problem with? They might have trouble placing it. Perhaps I can recommend a reviewer or something like that, because that's quite often something that you do in the initial stage. So it's a collaborative process. And just like when I'm working with my co-author, they are going to give me back a draft faster if I do a better draft. So the better the work you do, the faster the process should be, I believe. So moving along here. Here's a great question I have about review again. I really like this one. So if I'm invited to review a manuscript for, let's call it a lower tier journal, and we're talking here in terms of impact, the quality of the evidence and the quality of the findings, should I suggest to accept the manuscript at this sort of lower standard, whereas I might reject it somewhere else? So do I take it upon myself to make a judgment call in my reviews and offer criticism on whether this should be accepted by this particular journal in terms of impact, whereas I might reject the work, right, at a different journal, but this one I'm willing to accept it, and it's because of maybe level of evidence or something that I think it's more appropriate for this journal, even though it'd be quote unquote weaker. So it's sort of this non-binary thing of good science, bad science. It's this is good science, but maybe it belongs here, whereas I would reject it from somewhere else. How much as an editor do you want to see from your reviewers in that regard, judging that overall impact?
Right. So as I mentioned, high impact work are generally and requires several sophisticated techniques, a breadth of results, and novelty and originality, etc. So that can be, those same elements can be graduated down to less high impact journals. So instead of asking for data from protein mass spec that may not be available to everyone, would be enough to look at the activity of the protein as a replacement for some measures. So as you said, we are not graduating down the quality of the science, the questions and the impact that can have. Perhaps we're graduated the tools that you are using and how deep did you go? Did you generate a knockout or did you use a commercially available animal, etc. So I think that definitely if you're looking for a high science paper, you are gonna reject several, and most likely the papers that are go in rejection in high tier journals start walking the ladder down with less need for offering evidence and results supporting your ideas, but still you can contribute and they're super valid, and maybe you are really raising a point that nobody have appreciated before. And that what is very important, that even simple ideas in simple ways to answer, they are published. Your ideas and your work is important for everyone. So I definitely encourage to publish, even if it's not the top notch journal. You asked me about the reviewer. Sorry about that. I think that you can have that aspect and you should make the call.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think it's valuable to the associate editor as they're trying to synthesize reviews and maybe make that judgment call. It's not quite the same as the scope where it should kind of be decided beforehand. It's something that you do maybe need the opinion of a specific expert in that field. So I agree 100%. I have several others. I'm going to skip one question, but not because I think it's a bad question. It's just so far, it's a big conversation in its own right, which is why is peer review not a paid job? So whoever asked the question, I'm not skipping because it's a bad question. In fact, it may be one of the best questions. It's just beyond the scope of what we want to discuss today. A question here I do have, and perhaps you could clarify this a little bit, AV, based on what you talked about when you showed the different types of peer review. So why do so many journals use single blind peer review system? The short answer is that it's traditional, right? That, like, that's what we've started at. And so everything else is a transition away from that. But why do so many journals use it? The idea here from our attendee is it may give too much power to the reviewer and leave potential bias, particularly for a lot of the authors that we have in our webinar today, a lot of the authors that you and I deal with, AV, which is authors who have English as a second language or from less developed countries. They might prefer the double-blind system. So can you explain what the cons are, as you said, that we would do in the Q&A, of maybe a double blind versus a single blind? It's not necessarily just better because it's double versus single. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, So like you said, single blind, I think is the most traditional model. And I think for, many years, decades, it's just been a successful model. And perhaps that's why journals lean towards that, specifically in science. I think double blind is more common in social sciences and the humanities. But there are, like I said, pros and cons to different types of review. I think that this author that asked the question is correct. The reviewers can be, perhaps they can introduce bias if, they know an author is a non-English language as a first author, non-English speaking author, and therefore they automatically say that there's language issues associated with the journal, and that may or may not be the case. So that can be incredibly unfortunate. Double blind, of course, takes the confirmation that the author is a non-native English speaker off the table, because you don't know that. However, because certain communities are so small, sometimes you might be able to identify who your reviewers are as an author, and the reviewers also are going to be able to still identify the authors based on the work that they're doing, especially if, it's the next step in the research that they indicated they were going to do in a previous manuscript. So even though some, journals use these single blind or double blind systems, oftentimes reviewers and authors can have a good idea of who's actually reviewing and writing these manuscripts, which is, I think, why we are seeing as a community a lot of progression towards more of these open models of peer review, where both parties know who each other are, and that allows you to be very transparent in your reviews, and especially accountable in what you write, because your name's attached to what you're writing. But Jeanette, I'm curious about your comments on this, the pros and cons of single blind versus double blind, and any of the new models that are emerging.
Right. As you mentioned, the most traditional, as I have operated most of the time, my science life, I've been in the single blind peer review method. So we are used to it. It offers the comfort that, or maybe the easy way to being able to say something, and most young investigators feel like if they're not expert in the field, they may be saying something silly, or so it takes that away from a judgmental, right, identifying the reviewer. However, I found that new models are transparent review. Actually, I really enjoyed them. I think they are very informative, not only regarding the work. Sometimes the work has some implicit that as a reader, particularly if you're not in the area, you don't know, or you don't know what the discussion exactly was about an issue. So in that review, you learn. When you read those reviews, you learn. And so it's like having two papers. One is the technicality, the other more the fluent science discussion. Also, I think it's an excellent way that new reviewers can educate themselves on how to perform a review, looking at those examples and saying, wow, those are elements that I like, or what I should avoid because I really read something I didn't like it. And you are educating yourself. So now in that model, finding the reviewers, I think it would be harder. Mm-hmm. Not everybody has the time to elaborate deeply on a subject. So in that regard, is a little bit more difficult to implement. So I think there are pros and cons to everything. But all of them, in every model, exists the premise that your work is being evaluated fairly and biased. It's an ethical review, and you are being reviewed for what is in your manuscript and nothing else. So I think those principles apply to every single model.
Yeah, that's, I think, a major point is it's more trade-offs than a continuum. It's not going from like single blind and less bias to more bias. It's a change in bias, right? So if you go to transparent, it's more transparent, but it's also actually perhaps one of the most biased ones, because now you know people. You might have a senior author and a credibly junior reviewer, or the reverse situation. So that actually increasing bias, increasing bias, but also increasing transparency, accountability. So it's more about trade-offs with these models, and that's why. And this goes along with another question that we skipped over lower down, which is how do they choose? And it's based on the leadership at the journal, particularly if the journal is associated with a scientific society or something. It's very much tied to what that organization, what those academics in that sphere want as their approach or their system. So it's based on the decisions they're coming to, but also there are questions in publishing of what's the difficulty of doing this? Can we execute it? For example, in the double blind, it's very hard to actually implement double blind, right? It's you can say you're doing it, but you actually have no idea if you're accomplishing it, which means people are experiencing different review styles in effect when they get into it. Because if somebody is able to identify who their reviewer is, then all of a sudden they're doing a single blind, whereas the next person to submit a manuscript might be doing the actual double blind. So it gets a little bit less clear than just a simple continuum. Keep in mind that it's trade-offs and that some systems aren't 100% even implementable. So yeah. I have it. So this is a really good one. And I think we can each maybe give our one item for this. So what is the key to getting past the initial screening? So like sort of maybe the desk rejection, or even a rejection from in the initial processing stage by like a manuscript coordinator at the publisher. So for me, the key is rigorously follow the guidelines, the author guidelines. They're provided by every journal in some form or another. If they're not, or if they're incomplete, some smaller journals, oftentimes they're a little bit vague. Reach out and get questions answered. Everybody is a person with their own time restraints and their own biases. So make sure that if you do things perfectly for the organization you're sending the manuscript to, that gives you a much better chance of getting over that initial rejection. You still might get rejection because it's not within the scope, you chose a bad journal or something, but for me the big one is following journal guidelines. So I'm curious what your two would be.
Well, you definitely took mine. But I think that there's many, but I think that having a very clear and honest presentation of your work in your abstract is also very critical. So not only is the language well written, but it's clear what your study set out to do, what hypothesis you were testing, the results that you got, and your, implications of your research. That's all very clear from your abstract, and preferably your whole paper. But the abstract is, the thing that most readers scan and editors scan right before they make a decision. So I think that having that clear and upfront is important. What about you, Jeanette? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, those two, the two aspects you mentioned are critical, and I think they most definitely have a high weight on that screening. Perhaps another one that could help you greatly is to have a cover letter. You could even suggest people, colleagues that can be reviewers, not your friends, obviously, but somebody that you think they would be a fair reviewer for your work and understand the area. And again, explain why your work is important. It's hard to write a good cover letter, but do it and put it together with your package. It helps greatly.
I think that's a great point. You can make the case for your research in the abstract and the conclusions of your paper, left and right, but the cover letter is another opportunity for you to really make that claim and support yourself and put your impact right out there, right in front of everything. So that's an excellent point. Clark makes great points. And again, yeah, we are sorry that we can't answer all of your excellent questions, but again, we sincerely thank you for attending and for participating with us. It's also been our pleasure to have Jeanette here with us. We want to thank her for participating and answering some of these very insightful questions from our attendees. So thank you. And if you'd like to say a few words.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. Actually, this was quite an experience, and I hope that I answer the question and I resolve some doubts. And you can always reach out at Hindawi and ask questions.
All right. Again, remember that you'll be getting an email with the content of the webinar along with the certificate if that's something that you desire. And again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next month for our LetPub webinar series in November. So hope everyone has a wonderful morning, evening, or afternoon.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.